to this week's guest in a minute. But first, join our community by hitting the subscribe button and the bell so as soon as we post a new guest, you get it right away. And don't forget to hit the like and share buttons because that helps us grow the show. So welcome. Hit the subscribe button and let's get to this week's guest. Hey, hockey fans, welcome to the 7-Eleven Overtime Podcast. I'm your host, Gino Retta. You know, I've spent over 4 decades working in the game, fortunate enough to meet some of the great legends of the game, saw them come into the league, watched them shine in the game, and now they've moved on to life after the game. The 7-Eleven Overtime Podcast gives us a chance to catch up, tell some great stories, relive some great memories, and hear what they're up to today. On this week's show, wow, it's a first. We're going to go to a coach for the very first time ever on this podcast. And not just any coach, he's the winningest coach in NHL history, 9-time Stanley Cup champion, 5 with the Habs, 1 with the Pens, 3 with the Red Wings. The only coach in NHL history to lead 3 different organizations to Stanley Cup wins. Amazing. Hockey Hall of Famer, Scotty Bowman. Scotty, great to have you on the show, my friend. It's been a while.
Hi, Gino. Good to be on.
The last time you and I were on the same ice surface at the same time, I was covering your 3rd Stanley Cup final with the Detroit Red Wings, and you did something I've never, ever seen any other coach do, and I've been on the ice for many of the Stanley Cup celebrations, was you threw the skates on and skated the cup around instead of just holding it up in the air. I know the story behind this. Tell our audience why you did what you did and what led to that actual moment.
Well, as you know, Gino, I never got a chance to play in the league. I played junior hockey, and maybe I got a bit of a break. I was playing junior when there was only 6 teams, and I don't know if you would have made it or not, but I got into coaching really young, and I always wanted to play in the NHL, so that was going to be my last fling at coaching, and I had to do a bit of preparation, and I had to be a bit nervous because although it was a clinching game, I had told only the trainer, equipment manager, Paul Boyer, he's still there. I said, Paul, if it's close at the end, get my skates ready, I'm going to put them on. And boy, it was a 2-1 game. And then finally, Brendan Shanahan scored an empty net goal. I guess maybe 30 seconds left. So I took a chance. It was 3-1. I put the skates on, and so the rest was history. But it was a lot of fun to try to skate with that cup. And then I got pretty nervous because, you know, the confetti came down on the ice, and that cup at that time was 34 pounds, and I was 69. So, but it felt pretty light, but I didn't want to fall.
It was a great moment. It was a great, I mean, it's one of those things that, I mean, every kid dreams about hoisting the Stanley Cup at some point, but to do it in your very last game coaching, to make it 9 Stanley Cup titles, 3 of them with the Red Wings, what a way to go out. Could you have picked a better way to go out of the most successful NHL coaching career in NHL history?
Well, you know, I was very fortunate, Gino. I met some really great coaches. The 3 that come to mind when I was working with a paint company, I had a good boss, and he let me go up to the Forum. I had Dick Irvin, the late Dick Irvin. I was able to watch his teams for about 3 years. I used to go watch them practice. And then subsequently, Toe Blake. I had a lot of good memories with the great coach, Toe Blake. I've always felt 13 seasons in the league, and he won the Cup 8 times. In fact, I was coaching the night he retired for Montreal. They won their, that would be in 1969. They won the Cup, and the 68, the first Cup that I was in the final with, and Toasty, they would beat us 4 straight. So then I got good fortune later. I was coaching a junior team in Peterborough with the Petes, and they were a Montreal farm team. And the Leafs trained there for 6 weeks in the fall, and I got to have a good friendship with the Punch Imlach, and he was very, very cordial. He knew I worked for Montreal, but that had no bearing on it. And I used to go for lunch with he and with King Clancy. I played golf in Peterborough with Punch. and I had a great memory, and I really enjoyed my time. So those, I mean, there's other coaches I spoke to, but those three coaches, I mean, like when you think about it, that was the three, especially Toblake. And the odd part was Toblake and Punchimlak were as big a rivalry. They were rivals in the Quebec Senior League before they both went in the NHL.
God, Scotty, it's just so funny because I mean you're throwing out these names like it's nothing. Toe Play and King Clancy and Punch Him Black. Are there
great.
times? I mean, now people now put you in that category, obviously, of legends of the game. But as a young guy coming to the game, I mean, you mentioned yourself. You always had aspirations of playing the game, but you got hurt and never got to follow up on that dream. Did you ever, in your wildest imagination, think one day I'm going to be in the same conversation with the Blakes and the Emlaks and the Clancys of NHL history? Did you ever, in your wildest imagination, think that you would come up in a conversation like that?
No, because I started as a young coach and I coached junior, and I was very fortunate that I was able to coach a real good junior team, Junior Canadiens. They went to Ottawa, and then I got pushed up to go to Peterborough, which was an important team for Montreal. So I think basically what happened is I didn't think about coaching in the NHL. When you're coaching junior, most of the coaches in the NHL were ex-players, really. The thing kind of changed many years later. So as I got an opportunity, I coached the junior team in Montreal, and I owe my start to the late Lynn Patrick, because his son Craig, who I later went with Pittsburgh, Craig played for me with the Junior Canadiens, and that's when I got my break with expansion. I don't know if I ever would have had an opportunity, because the league, as you know, Gino, and a lot of people that we know now don't know much about the expansion, but the league went from 6 to 12. And
but this is the part, Scotty, this is the part that blows me away. You were part of expansion when the league went from 6 to 12 in 1967. And now you get the head coaching reins in St. Louis and the Blues. And there was a gradual process where you went from helping on the bench to leading the team. But not only did you lead the St. Louis Blues in their 3 years in the league, an expansion team. People talk about how Vegas has done so great in expansion. You went to the Stanley Cup final 3 straight years for a brand new expansion team. How did that happen?
I would say a lot of good fortune. Basically, Lynn Patrick was a good mentor as well. I should have mentioned his name, but Lynn turned the team over to me early in the first year. And when I look back, I was so fortunate. Imagine for 2 seasons we had, because I mean, Gino, you can go back and know the great goalies in the NHL. And until of recent vintage, maybe the last 20, 30 years, they always talked about 3 goalies in the NHL. I mean, I wouldn't discount Johnny Bauer, though, as a great goalie, but Terry Sawchuk, Glenn Hall, and Jacques Plante, mainly because they were 3 of the better teams. As you know, Glenn started with the Detroit, went to Chicago. Jacques Plante was in Montreal, of course, and Terry Sawchuk was a great player, a great goalie with Detroit. So, I mean, when you think about it, 2 of them were on our team for 2 years. I had the good fortune of getting a lot of good veteran players come out of retirement. 1 year we had Dickie Moore, another year we had Doug Harvey. So, I mean, I had a veteran team, and when you're a young coach and you're trying to find your way, it's pretty fortunate to be able to talk to these kind of. I got lots of stories I could tell you about playoff games, and one game in particular, I got to tell it because it's so funny now. But we were playing the 7th game for the Western Final to get into the Stanley Cup Final the first year, and we were playing in St. Louis against Minnesota. We lost Game 6 about 5-1, and we coming home after the game, and Glenn Hall at that time. He was a one of a kind, and he said to me honestly on the tarmac, "Who are you going to play in goal for Game 7?" And I said, "Glenn, what do you mean?" I said, "Our backup goalie was a wonderful man and played 20 games during the season, Seth Martin. I said, well, you're going to play. And I said, only you. And he said, well, I'm having a little difficulty. I don't know if I'm moving very well. And so anyways, I was fortunate. Doug Harvey was with us, and I went to Doug Harvey and I said, Doug, I'm getting pretty nervous about the goalie. And he said, don't worry about it. He said, are you going to practice tomorrow? I said, not really. He said, well, why don't we bring him out with 4 or 5 of the guys? And I did. And he said, I'll tell the guys to shoot at him if it looks like, sometimes they need confidence. And then we got his eyes checked. And now we're getting ready for the game. And the warm-up finishes, and Glenn comes by me, and he said, keep your eye on me. He said, I had an awful warm-up. Boy, I'm 32 or 33. I'm getting pretty nervous by now, and I'm looking for Doug Harvey. And it's about 10 minutes before the game, and he's not in the locker room, like in a stall. I find him in the washroom. It's about 10 minutes, must be 8:30 game. He's having a shave. I said, Doc, I got to talk to you. I said, we always called Glenn Hall the goalie. I said, the goalie came to me and he's really got me pretty nervous. I said, he asked me to keep my eye on him. And Doug said, Scotty, don't worry about it. He said, I'll keep both my eyes on him, but he'll be fine. And honestly, it's one game I always remember. We won the game in the second overtime, 2-1. And Cesar Maniego was playing goal with the North Stars. He stopped 55 shots, and Glenn Hall stopped 53 out of 54. And I mean, it was a goaltender's battle, but having those veterans on your team meant a lot to a young coach.
Oh, no kidding. I mean, you've had some great goaltenders, boy. And then you go from St. Louis to the Montreal Canadiens in a time where the Montreal Canadiens were everything. They were like you said, you grew up watching practices in the community and stuff, and now all of a sudden you're running their bench. You coached the Montreal Canadiens, one of the most storied franchises in NHL history, for 8 years. And in those 8 years, you win the Stanley Cup 5 times in a stretch of 7 years. When I look back on that era, I still shake my head. Some of the greatest teams of all time. We'll get to that in a second. But what was that like to walk into a room, to look at all the legends that were in that room every single day and walk around and go, now I'm the young guy that needs to tell these guys what they need to do to win. And yet you did it, Scotty.
We had a great combination. When I got to Montreal, they had won the cup, as you know, with the Ken Dryden story, and they had some young players that were just starting and had the winning atmosphere: Serge Savard, Guy Lapointe, Jacques Lemaire, Yvan Cornway, and then all of a sudden, I mean, Sam Pollock was a wizard with getting draft picks, and most of those great players, when you look back at the draft, Guy Lafleur, number 1 pick of Oakland, Steve Shutt was the 3rd pick of some other team. Bob Gainey was the 8th pick. None of the picks were Montreal's picks. They were always picks that he traded players, Sam Pollock. And so, the having the not veterans, but the young players that had won, and then the new players coming in, Larry Robinson came in the same year as Guy Lafleur, and then, of course, Ken Dryden winning 6 cups in about 7 seasons. So, yeah, it was a wonderful time to be back in Montreal because I was from there, and I grew up working for the Canadiens for 10 years before I went to St. Louis. So, when I look back on those teams, and when I look back at even all the teams I coached, I mean, it's not even changed today watching the NHL because I was on teams. I counted them up a couple of weeks ago. I was doing a story for somebody, and 8 of the goalies that played on different teams for me made the Hall of Fame. And I mean, when you think about it,
because they kept winning.
starting with Glenn Hall and Jock, and then going to Montreal, we had Rogie Vachon and Ken Dryden, and then I went to Buffalo and Tommy, and then I ended up in Pittsburgh with Tommy Barrasso, and then having my last season with Detroit, Dominic Hasek. So I mean, that's when I watched the game today, and I mean, there's a lot of teams that could win, maybe 6 or 7, maybe 7 or 8 even. You never know in the NHL. There's so many good teams, but the goaltending is such a factor. And somebody asked me the other day, what about all these goalies that are playing in the league? I said, yeah, it's over 90 goalies this year, but I said that's when I'm always amazed that these players in the heyday of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was only 6 goalies until expansion. And I said they were the 6 best goalies in the world. And now you got 80-something goalies. Not taking anything away from the goal scorers, because, I mean, how can we have a greater year than this year? Every time I look at I watch TV and I see the point totals. And I think because we have so many young players like McKinnon and Matthews, and these players that every game they push each other, and they get points nearly. When they get blanked, it's amazing. Like McKinnon didn't get a point last night, probably the first or second time maybe in 2 months.
Yeah, except for when his home point scoring streak got snapped, which was amazing because that was a crazy streak, 35 straight home games with a point, and only Gretz had more at 40, which is incredible. I'm going to ask you a question, which is kind of like asking somebody who is your favorite child. So I understand it's kind of an unfair question here, but the 1976 Montreal Canadiens only had 8 losses the entire season, and then you only lost 1 game. You went 12-1 in the Stanley Cup playoffs en route to winning the Stanley Cup. Was that the single greatest team you ever coached from start to finish?
It had to be with the record, because like we did lose 10 games another year in 11, but we, like you mentioned, we lost 1 game at home. I do remember the game. It was Halloween. We lost to Boston. I think Boston beat us 2 or 3 times that year, but yeah, we just kept going, and that was the year. When you think about it, we had the Canada Cup, and we had a lot of players that played for our Canada Cup team, and the 76.
It was maybe the best collection ever for a Team Canada, I think, in that 76 year.
Well, we had Serge Savard, and we had Guy Lapointe, Larry Robinson, Dennis Savard, and Bobby Orr. I mean, the only one who didn't make the Hall of Fame was pretty good defenseman with Philadelphia. His brother, he played Jim was his name, Watson, and he was a pretty good hockey player too. But yeah, Bobby Orr's last. It was a great thing that I was able to get on the good side of Bobby for one series, and I often kid him about it because I saw Bobby play when he was. I'm pretty sure he was just turning 14, and I generally talked to him on his birthday, which was only about 10 days ago, and he did remember. I saw Parry Sound playing in Gananoque. He was 14 years old, and that's the first time I ever saw him. And 2 years later, he was beating the hang out of us for Oshawa, and then 2 years later, he was in the NHL.
Speaking of the Boston Bruins, one of the classic moments, and we've relived this many times, 1979, you're facing the Bruins, Game 7 of the Stanley Cup semis. Don Cherry gets called for too many men on the ice, and Guy Lafleur goes out and scores to tie it. Then Yvon Lambert scored the OT winner to put the Habs into the Stanley Cup final. What are your recollections of that moment and that incredible turning point?
Yeah, it was a tough game for Boston because they were getting closer. We beat them in 77 in 4 straight, and then we went 6 games in 78. That wasn't the Stanley Cup final. The first 2 were. That was the conference final, and we were down in that game a couple of times, and that was our home ice too, a 7th game, and then we started to double shift Guy Lafleur with 5 minutes to go, and one of the better defensive players that ever played in that era was Donald Marcotte. He was a left winger, and he did a great job on Lafleur most nights. And we double shifted Guy, and there was a mix up at the bench. But it's like most coaches, they all blame the coach. But what happened is we double shifted Lafleur, and somebody on their team, I don't know which one, stayed on, and really probably should have been on the bench. And that went on for about 15 seconds, and then the linesman was John D'Amico, and he had no alternative but to call a penalty. That was a historic goal that allowed us to get into the final against the Rangers and keep get a chance to win that fourth cup. But Boston was getting really strong in those days.
So here's the question that many people are going to ask, because your numbers were incredible. 5 Stanley Cups in 7 years with the Habs, including 4 straight. After you win your 4 straight, you now go to Buffalo and take over the Sabres bench. How did that happen? How did the Montreal Canadiens lose grip of Scotty Bowman, the winningest coach in NHL history? How did that happen?
Well, I had an opportunity to get a better life, and my offer was so good. I was offered both jobs, and Montreal had gone through a transition the year before. Sam Pollock went in the business world, left the team, and went into business with the Brofmans, who had owned the Canadiens. And I just didn't feel comfortable knowing what he did for the team from the time that he became the manager in 1964 for the next, 13 or 14 years of winning all those cups. And I always said that if they would have gone after a manager at the time, the 2 managers that came to my mind in the league at the time were there was Emil Francis and Harry Sinden, but they probably wouldn't have left their teams with New York or Boston. But I had a terrific offer to go to Buffalo. I couldn't refuse it, and I took it. And I've stayed there for 40 years. It's amazing. I've lived in Buffalo since 1979, 45 years in the summer months now. But it's the one place I stayed there, and we could never do it in Buffalo. We came close a couple of times, but not close enough to win a cup. And that's the one place I wish we could have won a cup.
Yeah. So, I mean, Buffalo's near and dear to your heart, but to your point, it wasn't a winning stretch. The only non-winning stretch you ever had, quite frankly, as behind an NHL bench. So now at 53, you let go. It's 1987. You're still way too young to retire, but you're out of the game for a couple of years, and you join us in the ranks of the media. You become an analyst. What was it like?
I had a good time.
Talk about it.
Well, I met a lot of good people, and the one person that I really enjoyed, because I got put with him a lot of times early. I mean, I worked with Bob Cole and other people, but Don Whitman, the late Don Whitman out of Winnipeg. I went to do a lot of games in Calgary and Winnipeg, and Vancouver, and he taught me a lot. And I do remember my first few games. The toughest part I've ever done in hockey was trying to get a thought across with the producer telling me 9, 8, 7, 6. And the first few times, as he spoke to me in my ear, I stopped talking, and Don would give me the elbow, and after the game would be over, he said, it's something you'll get used to, but you got to keep your thought process going, and then you got to listen to the guys telling. And it was a producer. I don't know where he is now, but he had a lot of graphics all the time. The name was Larry Isaac.
Larry Isaac, legend in the game.
I don't know if he's still doing it, but he was a producer, and I learned a lot from those guys. I enjoyed going back to Montreal and Bob Cole. Got a couple of good stories about Bob Cole. I was doing one of the early games with Bob Cole, and there was a delayed penalty, and the referee had his hand up, but he was describing the play, and I tapped him. I give him a shot on his elbow, and I said there, and he looked at me. And when there was a stop, Bob said, "Don't you ever touch me again." he was, but he was he was a great announcer because he was in a zone. And then, of course, the other announcer that was very close to me, because I was able to recommend him, and they brought him to St. Louis. I mean, died much too young. Dan Kelly. I met him in Ottawa when I was with the juniors, and Mr. Solomon wanted to get their own announcer for the team. We tried to get Danny Gallivan. He wouldn't leave Montreal, of course. And Dan Kelly, the rest was history.
Yeah. So now you're in broadcasting, which is fun, but it's not where your heart is. You still had a lot of Stanley Cups to win. In the summer of 1990, you get a very important phone call, which gets you back into the game. Tell us about that call and how it ended up leading you to yet another Stanley Cup, this time with the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Craig Patrick was the manager at that time of the Penguins, and they were just starting to really rebuild, and they had hired the day before that I got the call. Craig hired Bob Johnson, the late Bob Johnson, to be the coach. So then it sounded pretty good for me. He offered me a chance to be with the Penguins, but I didn't have to leave Buffalo. I still had some in high school, and it was a pretty good offer. I was able to go with the Penguins, and I was able to do a lot of the work that I enjoyed doing. I scouted a lot. We made some really good trades, and I worked with Bob Johnson in the playoffs. Unfortunately, Bob passed away the next year, but that's how I got back into the game. Craig Patrick said, Bob's going to coach the team. I was not looking forward to coaching anymore, but it rekindled my chance to go back. And then I stayed in Pittsburgh 2 years, and then Detroit was rebuilding. And my time.
You had a pretty good team in Pittsburgh, though, Scotty. It was you had some pretty good talent in Pittsburgh.
I mean, it's hard to judge players over each other. I had a lot of. I can go back to my early days, and then St. Louis with Red Berenson and players like that. But to be able to think back and stand behind a bench and watch Mario Lemieux play, and knowing that he had a back that was not always 100%, and he was just when I try to compare players to him, it's just about impossible. Like he was unstoppable because Mario must have been 6'4" or 5" at the time. He had a great reach. He didn't use his size physically as much as they couldn't get the puck away from him, and I'm starting getting. I'm getting away from the story, but my granddaughter goes to college in the Purdue, and I'm watching Purdue a lot now. She's got me as a basketball, and I'm watching the guy that played
Zach Edey.
And I read his history. Edey, he went to Leaside High School. Yeah. And I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you know all about him. Then he went to not far from where I live in the winter. He went to the IMG Academy, and 7'4", and I read stories about him. I'm not sure who it was the other day. I was listening to the radio. They said when he was starting to play Little League, or not Little League, it must have been T-ball or something in Toronto. That this announcer was saying, every time he got up to the plate when he was 7 years old, the rest of the players hid because they didn't want to get hit with the ball.
That kind of happens on the basketball court now too, because they all hide. But to your point, though, it's that size differential, and people looked at Mario and think, the physical aspect of his game, but he never needed the physical aspect of his game because in a couple of strides and with that enormous reach, he could score like nobody his size had ever scored in NHL history, and it worked for him.
He would stretch his arms so the players couldn't get near him, because like when they tried to get near the puck, he'd push it on the other side. He had a hockey brain, Mario, that was so much ahead of everybody else. Even even having him on the team. I remember we had our power play, and we had Jaromir Jagr on one side, Mario on the other, and Mario was always telling everybody that on the power play, get as wide as you can. I'm going to be on the one side of the boards. He would tell Jagr, I want you on the other side because we could always come in and get our chances. But if we're too close together and going outside, we don't get the same chance. But he was I saw Mario play when he was maybe a midget or maybe a bantam. They had exchange programs in Montreal, and there was a man that used to bring teams from all over Quebec in to play at the Forum on a Saturday. And the man that ran it, the late Bob Beal, said to me, you want to stay and watch this boy from Villemard. It was just across the bridge from where I lived as a kid. And I went to see him play when he was 14, 6 foot.
It's amazing. You got to see Mario at his best, and I mean, he had the battle problems, and he also overcame the cancer issues and stuff. But you got to just kind of allow him, like, let him go and let him go do what he does. Then you shift to go to Detroit, where it was a completely different story. Jimmy DeVillano, a buddy of both mine and yours, brings you in to take over the bench in Detroit, where you had a team that could score goals but couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. They needed somebody to get in there and teach these guys how to win. And for them, it meant, quite frankly, and we talked about Stevie Yzerman, like scoring a pant load of goals, but just could not lead his team to victory. So you went in there and you had to try to change an entire mentality. Now, ultimately, it worked. You ended up leading them to 3 Stanley Cups, and gets back to the full circle where that's where you ended up retiring after you winning your 3rd cup. But what was that like to inherit a team that you say, guys, you guys can win, but you can't win doing what you've been doing, just trying to be an offensive juggernaut. It doesn't work in the playoffs. What was that like, Scotty?
Well, you're right. The team could score goals. The year before I got there, they had played a long series. They lost in overtime to Toronto. In Game 7 at the Joe Louis Arena, but they never had the mentality to really try to shut down teams, and that's one of the issues when you get into playoffs. The thing turns around, and goals are very valuable, and you're not going to get you might get the odd game where you get a handful of goals, but you're hanging on a goal or two most games, so. That's right.
You must have had some pushback in this.
I talked with Steve, and he had got 60 goals. I was very impressed. I never knew a lot about him. I was in the other conference with Pittsburgh. And, I said, Steve, it's going to be tough if you don't. You're going to have to really change your game. But it's not going to be pretty for you individually. Steve was so wrapped up as captain of the team for 10 years. With a lot of tough games in the playoffs and setbacks. I mean, he just took it on himself, and he became a completely, I would say at 28 probably, because he started when he was 18. And at 28, he went and played defense. He blocked shots. He killed penalties. He was just a completely different player. And I appreciated that kind of player. I had, because I had mentioned to him, I said, I had a player in Montreal who meant a lot to our team, Jacques Lemaire. And until we put Lemaire with Lafleur and Schutt, we couldn't play that line all the time against anybody. And I said, if we can play you against anybody with good wingers. But the other thing in Detroit that made a big difference is we were able to make a trade. We traded a defenseman that was a pretty solid guy. He passed away a little bit later, though, Steve Chason, and we got Mike Vernon. Yeah. And Mike came in after winning a cup. Mike had a big series against Montreal in 1989. He beat Patrick Roy, and then he came in, and with us, he turned us around. He worked with Chris Osgood. We only had him for a couple of years, but he won a big cup in 97, and then Chris Osgood won in 98. And of course, Kenny Holland was a wonderful general manager to pick up player. We didn't have a cap system. We had an owner that couldn't do enough for you, and Kenny was able to convince players to come to Detroit. And then we had the two Russians initially, Sergei Fedorov, and we had Vladimir Konstantinov, and then Slava Kozlov came in, and then we made a trade actually with New Jersey to get a depth defenseman, Slava Fetisov. He came in, and we didn't win that year. We lost to New Jersey 4 straight. And that summer, he kept calling me and saying, my best friend was Igor Larionov, and he wants to come to Detroit. And I said, well, they're not going to trade him. I said, he beat us in '93 with San Jose. And sure enough, they were looking for a winger. We had a lot of right wingers, and we traded a good goal scorer too. We traded Ray Shepard, but we got Igor, and those 5 Russians together, especially with Igor and Slava Fetisov, they were the veterans of the 3 young. Well, Konstantinov was sort of older than Fedorov and Kozlov, but they were magic. Those 5 Russians. I mean, I maybe looking back, probably wish I would have played them a little more, but I didn't want anybody to find out what they were doing.
So you went in there and you changed this mentality, and you do end up winning, finally getting it done. You end up winning 3 cups of the Red Wings after getting a lot of pushback, because I remember there were a lot of players who were not happy with the way you were taking them, but you just kept winning. Did anybody ever pull you aside at the end of it and say, Scotty, I'm wrong. I was wrong. I know I pushed back. I know I gave you grief, but you were right. Did you ever have anybody come up to you and admit that to you?
No, but the players, what happens, and you don't plan it this way, but a lot of the great players stay in the game. They either become coaches, a lot of them become scouts and managers. Right. And I think they get to see the other side. So time is often a big healer. But I never tried to change things. I said, I'm going to push as hard as I can. I'm going to treat you as tough as I can, because I want to win, and I want you to do the same thing. So I think in the final run, that's what they care about. People don't realize. I mean, even now with the contracts they have, people think, well, it's a glorious job. It's not a good job when you go to work every day and you don't win. Yep. It's no different than in business, or if you whatever job you choose. It's a tough job, hockey, and you've got a lot of fans that are behind you. You got a lot of family. You got friends, and winning is not easy. It's much tougher now with the 32 teams, of course, and the cap system. I don't know. You really have to adjust to all that, but it is different.
Yeah, it is totally different. Here's what I want to do. I want to play something we call 5 Fast Facts with you. I'll give you 5 quick questions. You try to give me 5 quick answers without thinking too much about it, because I want to see if I can catch you off guard on some of these and make you say some things you wouldn't ordinarily say. Are you up for it?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Time now to play 5 Fast Facts with the winningest coach of all time in NHL history, Scotty Bowman. Scotty, who is the best player that you ever coached?
Mario Lemieux.
Oh, good. See, I thought you were going to go hum and haw up, but Mario Lemieux is a good one. Who was the most underrated player you ever coached?
Oh, boy. I think I got to go with Bob Gainey, really.
Because?
I mean, he was such an important player for us.
Fair enough. Okay. Of all the Stanley Cup victories, which cup meant the most to you and had the biggest impact on your life?
The very first cup. When you're coaching and you can win that first cup, you don't know how many more you can win, but you figure that gets you into a club where you might be able to stay for a couple more years.
And it certainly worked out that way, especially since your first was with the Habs, the first of 5. If you could change one thing in the game today, what would that be?
I'd like to see the stick penalties. There's so many that I know they have to be careful, and they wanted to change the game, but I just find that the stick penalties, there's too many that are not warranted, and that's what bothers me the most. I don't want to see slashing and stuff like that. But I think it's hard for a player to keep his stick on the ice and go at full speed. His stick is going to get up a little bit. And unfortunately, I mean, I know if you impede the hands, it's a penalty. A lot of times the stick goes anywhere near the midsection. And, you know, especially, you know, there's an epidemic of penalties.
Fair enough. All right. If you hadn't become an NHL coach, what career do you think you would have been in instead over all these years?
Oh, I know I would have been a paint salesman. That's what I was. I could speak English and French, and I was on my way to being a good paint salesman.
Well, on behalf of all the hockey fans, I'm glad that you're not selling paint and you're actually that's what you did.
Thank you, Gino. Good luck. Bye.
The winningest coach in NHL history, 9-time Stanley Cup champion, Scotty Bowman. The Overtime Podcast is proudly presented by 7-Eleven and Athletes Care. Before leaving the rink, order your favorite Slurpee, fresh 100% premium Arabica coffee, hot from the oven pizza and wings, a pint of ice cream, or even a carton of milk, a dozen eggs, a loaf of bread from the 7 Now app, and Team 7-Eleven will have your order ready for pickup 24/7. Athletes Care is proud to be celebrating its 25th year, offering sports medicine services to both elite athletes and the general population who require rehab for a new or chronic injury or pain. Go to where the best go. Athletes Care Sports Medicine Clinics with 24 locations in the Greater Toronto Area and Ottawa. Hey, if you missed any parts of the show, don't worry. Visit our website at overtimepodcast.ca, where you can both listen and subscribe to future shows. 7-Eleven's Overtime Podcast can be found on Spotify, iTunes Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcast platforms. As well, check out and subscribe at our YouTube channel at O-Time Podcast. Until next week, I'm Gino Reda saying so long, hockey fans, and thanks for joining us on the 7-Eleven Overtime Podcast.